He was in a frantic state, and he just escaped from a bus where the rioters were pulling out all the Jews. It said, "Who is a Jew? Who is a Jew?" Pulling them out and killing them.
My guest today is Lyn Julius. Lyn is a journalist and author of the book Uprooted, How 3,000 Years of Jewish Civilization in the Arab World Vanished Overnight. She is also the co-founder of the charity Harif, the Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. Lyn, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me.
It's a real pleasure to have you. And let's start with your book. So your book, Uprooted, How 3,000 Years of Jewish Civilization in the Arab World Vanished Overnight. It describes the richness of Mizrachi. There we go. Yeah, hold it up to the camera.
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. You got getting the plug in early. That's what we like to see. It really... it really describes the richness of Mizrachi or Middle Eastern Jewish culture. Could you give our listeners a few examples of that culture, and who are the figures that stand out for you?
Well, I think the important thing to remember is that the Mizrachim, which is quite a recent term, meaning Easterners. And it refers really to the communities that were in the Arab and Muslim world. But in fact, they predated the Arab and Muslim conquest by about 1,000 years. So they are effectively the original, or one of the original peoples of the Middle East and North Africa. And therefore, they had a huge impact on culture in that region. And what is often described as Arab culture is not Arab at all, it's Middle Eastern. And the Jews actually had a very big effect on that culture because they have been in that region for so very long, for thousands of years. Of course, their impact, I'd say, culturally was religious. They had a huge impact on Judaism itself. For instance, the Babylonian Talmud was written in the Talmudic academies of Sura and Pumbedita in Iraq, well before Islam arrived. You had figures in the Jewish world like Saadia Gaon and Maimonides, and they made a huge impact on Judaism generally. In more recent times, I'm thinking of the colonial era in the 20th century, Jews made a huge contribution to not just a culture in terms of art and cinema, but also to trade, to modernizing the countries in which they lived. For instance, they were the ones who brought in all the sort of mod cons from Europe. The very first X-ray machine, the first record player, all sorts of things. The first cinemas were built by Jews. Jews were prominent actors, directors, and singers. They were also in politics to some extent, which was actually something quite new for them. Although there had been advisors to rulers in the Muslim world, the Jews were not really involved in politics. But in the 20th century, Egypt had a finance minister who was Jewish, and Iraq also had a finance minister who was Jewish. Jews sat in the parliament. They sat in the Turkish parliament in the early 20th century, and then in the Iraqi parliament, and they were represented in Egypt. So that was that was something quite new, I'd say. But it was a very brief period where they were able to really flourish in these countries, and it soon came to an end with decolonization.
Let's talk about that. How did it come to an end?
Well, it came to an end really with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were defeated in World War One, and the Western colonial powers set up their mandates. In fact, France had actually conquered North Africa before that in the 19th century. In 1830, they conquered Algeria, and Algeria became more than a colony of France. It became part of metropolitan France, actually. Then there were protectorates set up in Tunisia, Morocco. The Italians set up a protectorate in Libya. Egypt was a sort of semi-protectorate of Britain, Egypt and the Sudan. This was actually quite a golden age, because the colonial powers initially wanted to bring in equal rights for Jews and Christians, and therefore their situation was much better than it had been under the Turks. But this golden era, so to speak, came to an end with World War One, and the emergence of Arab nationalism. So Arab nationalism wanted to establish independent Arab states, but their concept really was it sort of excluded non-Arabs and non-Muslims from their vision of independence. And this is what happened, that the minorities were gradually sort of ushered towards the exit and marginalized and eventually expelled in many cases. Then, of course, there was the rising tension over Palestine, and this had an impact on the Jews living in these countries. But it was a very complicated situation. Decolonization had an impact too, because because Jews were identified with the colonial powers. They had served them very well. They dominated trade and the civil service and commerce. And therefore, they were considered, in a way, to have betrayed the Arab masses. And that, too, was a factor in what happened later, which was the sort of basic, expulsion or liquidation of Jewish communities.
Right. Right. And it sort of goes against this perception that Jews were actually treated very well in Muslim lands where they lived, in contrast to how Jews lived in Christendom. But that's not really accurate, is it? Because I'm wondering, Lyn, what was the relationship between the Jewish communities in these lands and their local neighbours and governments in the centuries they were living there and in the early 20th century?
Yeah, well, there is a myth that Jews and Muslims lived in perfect harmony before Israel was created and came and spoiled everything. But in fact, the status of the Jews and the Christians was of dhimmi, which is a special category under Islam. The Jews and the Christians were allowed to practice their religion, but they were continually reminded that they were inferior and subordinate to Islam. and therefore they had to abide by certain restrictions. They had to be continually humiliated, and they had to pay a tax. And basically, what they did was subcontract their right to self-defense to the ruler of the day. The ruler would so-called protect them. But this was not a privilege, as is sometimes described. It was really like paying the mafia to make sure that you are physically left alone, or that you're physically secure. So the question is, protect from what or whom? And it's not generally appreciated that the environment was really quite precarious. It could be very unstable, especially between rulers. There was the ever-present threat of violence from the mob, especially in North Africa, so much so that Jews were actually enclosed in a mellah or ghetto, especially in Morocco, in Tunisia. They were kept behind locked gates, really, and this was to protect them, because the mob could sort of invade the Jewish quarter at any time and loot their possessions. They could also kidnap their daughters, and this was really an ever-present threat. So there was no security for these Jews. They had no legal rights, or very, very few legal rights. They could prosper, they could thrive depending on the ruler of the day, but they could also be taxed to a great degree, or they could be expelled, or they could be accused of fabricated, on fabricated charges, and they had no defense against this sort of thing. And people make comparisons with the situation in Christendom, and they say, it was better than under the Christians. Well, I'd say it's very, very comparable to the situation in the Middle Ages, in medieval Christendom, where the Jews were sort of protected by the king. They were a useful source of tax or tribute, but they were also dispensable, and so they were also they were at the mercy of the ruler, and they were also if the ruler was got rid of, then the Jews would be very vulnerable as well. There is one big difference between their treatment under Islam and their treatment under Christendom, and that is Islam never had a theological hostility towards Jews. They didn't accuse Jews of having killed Jesus. And this is a big difference, because the blood, this libel, the blood libel that Jews kill Christians for their blood, and Jews killed Jesus. That is something that was used, to spark pogroms in Europe. And that wasn't really used up until the 19th century in the Muslim world. And it was Christians who brought that idea into the Muslim world. So that is one of the big differences.
Right. Now, just to give our listeners a real sense of perspective, I want to share some stats right now. So in 1948, the Jewish population of Iran was about 100,000. Today, it's about 8,000. Morocco's Jewish population fell in the same period from 260,000 to 2,000. Yemen, 60,000. Egypt, 75,000. Syria, 25,000. Iraq, 135,000. And Libya, 35,000 Jews. Today, all of these countries have very few, if not zero, Jews. And most of those changes happened in the late 1940s and the 1950s. Lyn, what happened in these countries to these communities at that time? And what does it mean for these communities to, as you say, vanish?
Well, as you say, the decline was extremely dramatic in a generation and a half. We went from hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of Jews to maybe zero or less than 10 for most of these countries. And the figure for Morocco at the moment is probably less than 2,000. And the figure for Iran, which is not an Arab country, is probably less than 8,000 now. So how do we explain this dramatic decline? I'd say Arab nationalism played its part, as I tried to explain. Also, the rise of Islamism, which actually goes back to the 1930s, to the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in Egypt. And they incited riots against the Jews of Egypt and against the Copts as early as the 1930s. Then, of course, there was the influence of Nazism on Arab nationalists. There was the import of Christian and Nazi antisemitism into this region, sort of Nazi ideas of Jewish conspiracy and control. Then there was a backlash against Israel's victory in the first Arab-Israeli war and subsequent wars. The Arab governments really took their frustration out on what remained of their Jewish communities. So it was all these factors really that contributed towards the ethnic cleansing, I think you can call it, of these Jewish communities. There was a lot of state-sanctioned persecution. Beginning in 1947, the Arab League, which was founded in 1945, actually drafted anti-Jewish laws, stripping them of their citizenship, dispossessing them of their property, freezing their bank accounts. But the main thing they did was to criminalize Zionism. And that meant that Jews could be arrested, they could be jailed, and they could even be executed for being Zionists. But how do you define Zionism? You know, is having a Magen David on your talit, on your prayer shawl, is that Zionist? Is that Zionism? And so all sorts of spurious excuses were produced in order to criminalize Jews. And this, of course, put Jews in a very precarious and dangerous position. Coupled with outbreaks of violence. I mean, there were riots in several of these countries in the 1940s. Jews were physically under threat. They could not rely on the forces of law and order to protect them, and therefore they were desperate to leave. And what happened was Israel organized several rescue missions to save these communities. In the case of Libya, Yemen, and Iraq, 90% of the communities were actually airlifted or shipped to Israel. And 90% of these communities really came to an end within just a few years of the creation of Israel.
Right. And I want to go back a minute to something you mentioned. You mentioned the effects of Nazism on Arab nationalism, on Arab culture. And I think that's a really interesting point, because I think a lot of our listeners may not realize that one did have an impact on the other. When first hearing about it, they do sort of sound like completely different worlds. And I really want to know, Lyn, what was the impact that Nazism had on Arab culture, on the Arab world, both on the Jews living there and in the culture itself?
Yeah, well, I think beginning at the end of the 1920s, fascism experienced was born in Italy. Nazi parties were already taking hold in the 1920s. And Hassan al-Banna founded the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in 1928. And he was influenced by Nazi ideas. And what he actually wanted to do was to turn the clock back, establish a caliphate, which obviously had come to an end with the end of the Ottoman Empire, and for Jews and other minorities to revert to their original dhimmi status before the colonial era. But what he did was to import these ideas, which originally were Christian ideas of Jewish conspiracy and control. The Mufti of Jerusalem was also a very big player in all this. He became the leader of the Palestinian Arabs. And what he did was he kind of mixed traditional prejudices against the Jews, which you find in the Quran, with these new kind of Nazi ideas that the Jews wanted to dominate the world and have to be fought at all costs. And what is not often realized is that the Mufti already started inciting against Jews outside Palestine. In other words, he was an anti-Semite before he was an anti-Zionist, or maybe he might have started out as an anti-Zionist, but anti-Zionism soon spilled over into outright anti-Semitism. So wherever he went in the Arab world, he incited hostility against the Jews. Of course, the ultimate example of this was what happened in Iraq. In Iraq, the Mufti of Jerusalem actually found himself in Baghdad in 1939, having been defeated by the British in the Arab Revolt. And for 2 years, he did not cease to try and overthrow the pro-British government there. And he incited against the Jews. The culmination of all this was the Farhud, which is a massacre of Jews on the 1st and 2nd of June 1941. We will probably never know how many Jews were killed. The official figure is 179, but some estimates put numbers at maybe 600 or more. And this is generally recognized now as having been caused by pro-Nazi or Nazi incitement, propaganda broadcasts from Radio Berlin, and the activities of the Mufti and his acolytes. In fact, they overthrew the pro-British government in April 1941, and they set up a pro-Nazi government which declared war against the British and an alliance with the Germans and the Italians. This is not often recognized. This was the only Arab country that was allied with the Nazis in 1941. And later on, the Mufti had a meeting with Hitler, and he said he wanted to manage the extermination of the Jews. when the Nazis defeated the Allies, he would look after the Jews in his sphere of influence, so to speak. Now, this, I think, is still with us today. This sort of way of thinking, this anti-Semitic kind of Nazi anti-Semitism is still with us today. I think Hamas is an expression of this. The Islamists have taken on board these anti-Semitic ideas, and they originate with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, ideas of conspiracy and Nazi ideas that the Jews want to dominate the world, something that is actually quite alien to traditional Islam.
Right, and that sort of brings me on to my next point, which is during anti-Israel protests throughout the Western world, time and time again, we hear the chant Khaybar Khaybar Ya Yahud Jaish Muhammad Sayyahud, which translated in English means Jews, remember the Battle of Khaybar, the army of Muhammad is returning. Now, the Khaybar chant is a classic Arabic battle cry referencing the massacre and expulsion of the Jews in the town of Khaybar in northwestern Arabia, now Saudi Arabia, in the year 628 CE. Could you tell us a bit more about the event referenced in the chant and what the chanting means today?
Muhammad offered he tried to convert them to his new religion. They refused. And of course, they were punished by the Jewish tribes being massacred. And Khaybar was the final battle against the Jewish tribes in Arabia. So there is this history of if you like, that of hostility between Islam and Judaism. But as I said before, the Jews were defeated. And therefore, that chapter was closed, if you like. It closed with the expulsion of the last Jews from Arabia. And sort of end of story. Then a new chapter was opened with the Pact of Omar, which decreed that the Jews and the Christians would be dhimmis. As I explained before, this was a subordinate status where the Jews would be, allowed to exist on payment of this tax. So that was the status that really governed the Jews for most of the 13th centuries, that Jews and Muslims lived alongside each other. And what's changed is this new idea of Jewish power, I believe, which came in the 19th and 20th centuries. And what the and who are the people who are using these old Quranic episodes like the Battle of Khaybar are using it really to further their own ideology, which is an anti-Semitic ideology, which wants to restore the arrogant dhimmis who are now proclaiming their own state in Israel. I mean, this is absolutely unheard of and shouldn't be allowed, for the Jews to have political power. And these Jews are trying to dominate the world and must be defeated. This is the sort of thinking behind it. So of course they do make reference to the Battle of Khaybar because that supports their ideology. But I don't agree with people who say, "Oh, Islam has always been anti-Semitic in this way." I think there's a new element that we're up against, and that is political Islam. Which is a 20th century phenomenon and which has absorbed anti-Semitic ideas from Christianity and from Nazism.
What changed?
So what changed was, as I say, the foundation of political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood, all these offshoots we have now called, ISIS, Islamic State, Al Qaeda, Al Nusra, Hamas. They are not necessarily, sort of rooted in Islam. I mean, if you look at the Hamas charter, it's pure conspiracy theory about the Jews. That the Jews started the French Revolution and all that. That is not, in Islam. It's a new thing altogether. So what they've done is harness, just old ideas from the Quran, and they're using them to further their own modern ideology of political Islam.
I want to go back to something you touched upon earlier, which is the Farhud, which is an extremely important and tragic event in Jewish history, as you know, especially for those of Mizrachi descent and particularly the Iraqi Jewish community. For our listeners, what is the Farhud and why do Jews commemorate it every year?
Yeah, well, I think all Jews should commemorate the Farhud. It's not something that just pertains to Iraqi Jews or Mizrachi Jews. In the same way as all Jews commemorate other episodes in Jewish history, the Holocaust, it's a Jewish story. The Farhud is a Jewish story. I tried to explain its significance, really, because it's one of those examples of a massacre of Jews that occurred well before Israel was founded, 7 years before Israel was founded. And therefore, you can't say, oh, well, Zionism is to blame for this. You could say, well, the Jews were on the side of the colonialists, and but to actually go from there to actually massacring hundreds of Jews, it's a huge leap, isn't it? I mean, what did they do? What did they do really to deserve this fate? I think what it points to is the fact that the hatred that the Mufti had for the Jews inside Palestine, spread. It spilled over into the Arab world, and the Farhud was really the first example of Jews being punished as Jews. It was a purely anti-Semitic event. It was caused by Nazi propaganda. In the run-up to the Farhud, there were broadcasts, to kill the Jews. There was a huge amount of incitement. Over 2 days, Jews were massacred. Their homes were looted. And they were only saved really by honourable Muslim neighbours. They were not saved by the police and the forces of law and order. In fact, the police were complicit with the rioters in many cases. I mean, I have my mother. My mother told my story, her story, which is that that they barricaded themselves in the neighbor's house, and there was a knock on the door, and it was the Jewish cook of my mother's aunt who was, knocking on the door to be let in. He was in a frantic state, and he just escaped from a bus where the rioters were pulling out all the Jews. It said, "Who is a Jew? Who is a Jew?" Pulling them out and killing them. And he said he was a Christian, and he ran as fast as his legs could carry him, and ended up at where my mother was. So it was a terrible episode. It really shocked the Iraqi Jewish community to the core, because they hadn't experienced anything like that within living memory, and it was a major factor, I would say, in the departure of the Jews from Iraq 10 years later. It was fear of another Farhud, which really made them want to leave. So when they had the opportunity, and it was a very short window of opportunity of just 1 year that they were allowed to leave on condition they forfeited their Iraqi citizenship, and eventually all their possessions were seized as well. During that very short window, 90% of the Iraqi community decided to leave. It was just too risky to stay in Iraq. And this is where, when my family actually left in 1950, but they didn't go to Israel like most of the Jewish community. They came to England.
Why, can I ask why they came to England instead of Israel?
Yeah, well, they actually had connections, and they managed to get passports to England. My father had studied in England during the war, so it was easier for him. He thought he would find a job more easily than if he went to Israel.
Right. Now, I want to get on to Harif, which is a charity that seeks to preserve and celebrate the culture of Middle Eastern and North African Jews, which you co-founded. How and why was Harif born?
Yeah, well, it also seeks to educate. It was born about 16 years ago now. Why did we set it up? Well, we set it up because there's a crying need for education about what happened to the Jews from Arab and Muslim countries. We're talking about the last generation born in Arab and Muslim countries who are alive now, but they're all, well into their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And when they die, there'll be nothing left. And that's why it's important to preserve the memory of that life. So what we do is we're run by volunteers. There are 6 of us, and during the pandemic, we've been running Zooms. We've done over 70 on all different aspects of Jewish history, culture. Ranging from cookery to Judeo-Arabic to, Jews in the Far East, Baghdadi Jews, Jews in India, Jews in Borneo, music in Morocco, all sorts of subjects. And you can watch the videos of past Zooms on our website, which is www.harif.org. And we welcome everybody to join our mailing list. You don't have to be Sephardi or Mizrachi to be interested in the topic.
Well, I think you've given quite a comprehensive answer on how Jews are often viewed from the outside world. But I really want to get your take on how the experience of Mizrachi Jews and their heritage, their views and their needs are treated within the Jewish world.
Yeah, well, I think we're up against this problem that the diaspora is mainly Ashkenazi, and they actually don't know the story. And that was one of the reasons why we set up Harif about 16 years ago, to educate people about the story. It's particularly bad in places like America, where people never really meet Sephardi or Mizrachi Jews. Even here in Britain, they are perhaps no more than 10% of the community. So there is this massive ignorance, which we are trying to fight. I think it's important for us to see the Middle East conflict in the context of Arab and Muslim anti-Semitism. There are too many people who invoke the Holocaust in the same breath. And it's not to do with the Holocaust in the sense that Jews were displaced by Arabs, and a majority of Jews in Israel are there because of the Arabs, not because of the Nazis. And I think this needs to be front and center in the way people see the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Right. And as we draw to a close, Lyn, I want to ask you, for those looking to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where would you recommend they start?
Well, read my book.
Perfect answer.
No, I think we need to stop being so Eurocentric. As I say, most Jews in Israel are Middle Eastern Jews. They are not strangers to the region. Jews generally are indigenous to the Middle East. We need to make the point that we've that we were victims of Arab and Muslim anti-Semitism, and that's why we're grateful that Israel exists. Well, of course, those of us who ended up in the West, were able to resettle and get full rights, but even that is precarious. Look what's happening in France, where at least 10 Jews have been murdered just for being Jews. And there's a great deal of insecurity, as you know, in the French Jewish community. Look what's happening in America. For the first time in decades, American Jews are feeling, vulnerable. What can we do? We can educate, we can, raise awareness of what happened in the Middle East to the Jews. And I think that will help to achieve a greater understanding, of the whole problem in the Middle East, and hopefully will advance the cause of peace and reconciliation.
Yes, I hope so. Lyn, as we wrap up, tell the listeners, what have you got coming up and where can people find you?
Well, I've got an ongoing blog which I maintain with all sort of news stories, anything related to Jews in the Arab and Muslim world. You can find this blog. It's called Point of No Return. Just Google Point of No Return blog, and it's updated every day. You can sign up to the mailing list and get daily alerts from it. And you can sign up the Harif mailing list and see what we're doing in the way of interesting events. And I think you should also help commemorate the exodus of Jews. We haven't talked about the 30th of November, but that is the day in the calendar which was designated to commemorate the exodus of Jews from Arab countries and Iran. It was actually, it grew out of a law that was passed in the Knesset in 2014. And every year, Israeli embassies all over the world are instructed to commemorate this day in cooperation with local organizations. So, this is something that Harif does every year. We have a commemorative event, but there's no reason why everybody shouldn't have their own commemorative event. And that way we can really raise awareness of this whole issue.
Absolutely. Lyn Julius, thank you so much for appearing on Podcast Against Anti-Semitism.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Ellie.